You have your Bibles, if you would, please turn to Mark, the 12th chapter. Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 31 is where we want to give our attention this morning. Mark 12, 28 through 31. It says, "And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, Which commandment is the most important of all? And Jesus answered, The most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these." What I'd like to focus on this morning is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is identified as one of the two great commandments. There's no commandment greater than the commandment to love the Lord with all that you are and to love your neighbor as yourself. And as we look at that phrase, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, we see that it's rather lofty language and that it is very broad or general language. There's no specifics about it. There's no description about what it means to love your neighbor. There's nothing provided there for us to determine whether or not someone is in fact loving their neighbor. Just the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? And maybe that's not the best way to phrase the question. Maybe we ought to say, what does it look like to love your neighbor as yourself? This isn't going to be a theological lesson this morning. We won't be talking about the nature of God or any of those kinds of theological things. This is not going to be a philosophical lesson or an academic sermon that's designed to instruct in some piece of information. It's going to be a very functional sermon, very practical in its nature. It's not going to be exhaustive. We don't have time to be exhaustive. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I'll suggest to you that there isn't this is what it means to love your neighbor and a list of things that you have to do in order to love, because the list would be too long. The world couldn't contain the books of what all that command consists of. So all we can do is look at a sampling of things that might help us to understand what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself. And so we want to look at some practical examples this morning. And I want to turn your attention to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes 7, verses 21 and 22. And for those that are in the live audience here, the list of verses that we'll be talking about this morning should be behind me. I think almost all of them are there. I hope it's big enough for you to see it. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 21 and 22 give us some insight about what it means to love your neighbor as yourself when it comes to speech, particularly when it comes to judging other people's speech. We live in a world where we communicate. Human beings are created to communicate, to share ideas, to express ourselves. We all have lots of opinions, and those opinions are very often expressed. And in fact, we live in a time when there is more expression of personal ideals and thoughts than probably any time in recent history. We have a great many of avenues to express ourselves and a great many ways to publish our speech. And so lots of people are saying lots of things. How do I judge someone's speech? He says in Ecclesiastes 7, 21 and 22, "Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others." I love this text because not only does it tell us that we need to be very understanding and very generous to the reactions that we have to what other people say. Don't take it to heart. Don't take it personally, in other words. Just because you hear someone say something, and even if that something is critical of you, don't take that to heart, he says. And then he tells us why. We need to think about our own communication failures. The times that we've misspoken, the times that we've jumped to conclusions and drawn judgments before we had all the information. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. You have said things offensive to other people, and because you're aware of that fact, then you need to be charitable in dealing with other people's speech. And think about that. That's what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself. I want people to understand when I misspeak. I want people to cut me some slack. I want people to not give me a hard time or not be overly critical about every little word that I say. I want people to understand that when I do it. And when I'm aware of the many times that I have done it, then maybe I'll be a little bit more understanding when they do it. Consider James 3:2 in connection with this. James 3:2 says, "For we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body." Now what James 3:2 suggests is that the only way that I'm ever going to be perfect in my speech is if I am perfect in every aspect of life. And as long as I have failings in controlling myself in one respect or another, I can be certain that I will lack control in what I say. If I understand that, and I love my neighbor as myself, then I'm going to understand that about them as well. They're going to make mistakes in what they say, just like they're going to make mistakes in every area of life or every weakness that they have. In fact, James ultimately argues that the most difficult thing to do is to control the tongue. That it's a mighty force that's hard to rein in and control, that we can control all the beasts of the earth, but to control the tongue, we can't do. We need to understand that. What about in our own speaking? How we speak to others and what we do and how we communicate with others. Ephesians 4 and verse 25. There are a whole lot of places we can go, but we'll look at only that one verse. Ephesians 4 and verse 25. "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we're members one of another." As we mentioned in the Bible study this morning, there is a direct correlation between this idea of love and this idea of relationship. Love your neighbor as yourself. Why? We're members of one another. We have a relationship with one another. We're connected to one another. And so he says, in your speaking to one another, put falsehood away and be truthful to one another. With our own speaking, if we love our neighbor as ourselves, that's exactly what we'll do. We'll tell them the truth. We'll be honest. In 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11, we're introduced to an attitude that we ought to be aiming for, or a condition, I guess I'll say it, that we ought to be aiming for. It's more than an attitude, it's a circumstance. And every behavior that we engage in, both speech and action, should in some way help us reach the aim of this circumstance. He says, "Finally, brothers, rejoice, aim for restoration, comfort one another, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you." Aim for restoration, aim for agreement, aim for peace between ourselves and others. And the God of love and peace will be with you. God's nature is love and peace. He wants to be reconciled with man. He wants to express His love to man. He wants man to express His love back to Him. And He wants that relationship to be intact. He wants there to be peace between Himself and mankind. And if we are servants of the living God, and if we are acting in a godlike fashion, in righteous ways, then we aim for restoration. When there's problems, when there's discord, when there's separation between us and others, we aim for restoration. We look for the ability to comfort one another, not make one another discomforted. We look for ways to build one another up, to edify one another, to strengthen one another, to encourage one another, to give people the strength and the courage to face the trials of this life. Comfort one another, agree with one another. I think far too much of our time we are looking for places where we disagree with people. What he says here is agree with one another. Make it your aim to agree with one another. Look for what you have in common. Build on what you have in common. Strengthen what you have in common. And grow from there. That's what you do when you love your neighbor as yourself. Live in peace. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 13, God introduces the idea of forgiveness and the attitude of forgiveness that ought to be present. When we love our neighbor as ourselves, we ought to be a forgiving person to our neighbor. Colossians 3:13 says, bearing with one another. Meaning that you bear up under the load with one another, that you carry the weight with one another, that you suffer through the difficulties with one another, bearing with one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. We need to understand that everything that God does toward man is coming forth from His love for mankind. God so loved the world. And so because of His love, He is willing to forgive, and He looks for a way to forgive. In fact, He made the way to forgive. We didn't have the ability to get from our condition of sin and separation from God to reconciliation and peace with God on our own. He had to make the way. He was the one who was sinned against. He was the one who was slighted. He was the one who was mistreated. And yet it was He who made the way for forgiveness to even be possible. There's something to learn in that. We need to bear with one another and forgive each other. Find ways for forgiveness to come to pass. Not harbor grudges. Not hold on to ill will. But look for a way to make reconciliation possible. That's what he's suggesting here. That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. I want to be reconciled. I want to be at peace. I want to get along with people. I want people to be understanding toward me. I want people to bear with me when I make mistakes. I want people to carry me along sometimes. To give me the time to grow up and to mature and to learn. And so if I love them as I love myself, then I express those things toward them as well. I bear with them. And I forgive them. Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 and 22, Jesus sets the constraints of this. Peter comes up and says, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Now I'm going to rephrase his question. I'm going to put it in our common vernacular. This is Peter's question to Jesus. Lord, how often do I have to forgive my brother? How many times do I have to be willing to forgive him? You know, I'll do it that first time and maybe the second time, but 3 strikes and you're out. I just can't continue to deal with this. If they're not willing to change and they're not willing to do what's right, I can't deal with it beyond that. Listen to what Jesus' response is. Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said, I do not say to you 7 times. 7 is a symbolic number as it's used here and used in literature and used in other places portraying completeness. There are 7 days in a week, for instance. We get the idea of completeness from that number. Do we do it as many as 7 times? He says, I don't say 7 times, but 77 times. Put it simply, Jesus said, as many times as is necessary. Don't just do it until you think you've done it enough. do it multiples of time on top of that. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you forgive. Because you love peace. And you want to make for peace. I want to turn to Zechariah chapter 7 and verse 9 next. There, again, are many places that we can go to talk about justice and mercy. But I like the way the prophet Zechariah puts it here. I like how direct it is. I like how simple it is. Zechariah 7 and verse 9, he says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgments. Show kindness and mercy to one another." I would suggest to you and submit to you that that's what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself, to be just with them and to be merciful toward them. To render true judgments. To not allow yourself to jump to conclusions or think the worst or make decisions based upon partial information. And it's hard. It's really hard. To put this in a non-emotional way, we watch the evening news and we find out that John Smith has been arrested for doing some act, and we immediately assume what about John Smith? We immediately assume that he's guilty. That is not true judgments. Those are prejudicial judgments. Making decisions before information is there. Making decisions about things that you don't have the information to draw conclusions about. He says, render true judgments, actual judgments, collect information, hear both sides of the story, try to make a fair and just decision about things before you make a judgment about them. Hard to do. But that's what I do if I love my neighbor as myself, because I'm going to tell you this, I want people to render true judgments when they look at me. I want them to take the whole picture into consideration. I want them to take all of the evidence into consideration. I want them to render a true judgment about me. I want them to show kindness and mercy. So he says, show kindness and mercy to one another. That's what we do. We're kind in our judgments toward others. We're merciful in our judgments toward one another. We seek to understand. That's if we love them. In Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 14, there's a statement made that reflects upon our fairness in dealing with people. If you make a sale to your neighbor, or you buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You see, if I love my neighbor as myself, I don't try to take advantage of them. Watch a television show every once in a while on American Pickers, on History Channel, called American Pickers. One of the things that strikes me, I don't know these guys other than the persona that they're placed on in this television show, and I don't know if this is their regular business practices, but I know that there are many, many times that I've seen them on the television show that they start a negotiation for something that they want to buy from someone, and someone goes, oh, well, I'll take this for it, and they throw a number out there, and the response comes back, no, that's way too much. The value of this is more in this area. And it works the other way as well. No, that's way too low. This is worth this much money. I'll give you this for it. That's being fair. That's not taking advantage of people. See, I'm not going to let someone take advantage of me and charge me some great price for something that doesn't have that value. And I'm going to say, no, that's not right. But it's got to work the other way around if I'm going to be fair and not wrong someone else. When they say to me, well, I'll give it to you for $1 and it's worth 10, then I stop them and say, no, I can't. I can't take that for only $1. It's worth much more than that. This is what I'll give you for it, a fair price, a just price. If you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. See, that's what we do when we love our neighbor as ourselves. We don't wrong one another. This statement to love your neighbor as yourself affects our interpersonal and social relations in many, many ways. Turn to Romans chapter 12. Romans 12, we're going to read verses 11 through 21. Each one of these sentences through this section of Scripture really serves as its own point regarding interpersonal and social relations between people who actually love one another. Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. And so here's this idea of being patient with people. Here's this idea of contributing to their needs, of showing hospitality, not just showing hospitality, but seeking to show hospitality, looking for opportunities to provide needs to people. That's what you do when you love folks. You look for ways to help them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. That's what you do when you love folks. You empathize with them. You feel their joys and you feel their pain. You're connected to them. They're your neighbors. Bless those who persecute you. I skipped that one. Bless and do not curse. What about my neighbor who's not treating me nice? Well, if I love my neighbor as myself, then I'll go ahead and treat him right anyway. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Don't start thinking that you're better than anyone else. Listen, if you love your neighbor as yourself, then you view them as your equal. Don't be haughty. Associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Don't think that you're smarter than everyone else around you. Respect their intelligence. That's what you do when you love your neighbor as yourself. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Do everything in your power to be at peace. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you'll heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We looked at that a few weeks ago in a great amount of detail, that last part of this. But understand that that is part of the interpersonal and social relationship of someone who loves neighbor as self. I don't want for everyone to come at me seeking vengeance against me. And even if I'm one of those people who is vengeful, I tend not to be vengeful against people that I care about people that I love. If I love my neighbor as myself, then I'm not a vengeful person against people. I don't repay evil for evil. Because while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. There's the example of what it means to love. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. In James chapter 5 and verse 9 it says, do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. We have an obligation not to grumble against one another. Listen, we will from time to time do things that are wrong. We will from time to time say things that are wrong. We will from time to time do things that we ought not do and mistreat one another. Those things are going to be, but that doesn't have to be as divisive as we make it. It doesn't have to destroy relationships. It doesn't have to keep us apart. Not if we love our neighbor as ourselves. We don't grumble against one another. 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7 talks about some subjective attitudes that we have, these personal attitudes that govern our relations with others. Love is patient. Love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, that means that I need to be patient with my neighbor because love is patient and kind. I need to be kind. And the interesting part about that is that is usually what people think when the statement, I love people, is uttered. Oh, he's a good guy. He loves people. What we really mean by that is he's kind to people. That is a part of what it means to love people, but that's not all of it. Just because I'm kind to people, that doesn't mean that I love people. But if I'm not kind to people, it means that I don't. Love is patient and kind. It does not envy or boast. That is to say that if I love my neighbor as myself, I don't envy what they are or what they have or their successes, and I don't boast about my own. Not if I love folks. Envy is not a good thing. Envy makes you feel bad. When other people are boasting about their accomplishments and boasting about what they have and boasting about who they are, it makes you feel bad. It makes you feel less. It makes you feel lower. It demeans you. Love doesn't do that. It doesn't envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It doesn't insist on its own way. If I love my neighbor as myself, I don't insist on getting my way all the time. Instead, I make room. I make room and I make a way for them to get what they're looking for. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. Now, there are irritable days. There are days when we are irritated and we are irritable and it seems like everything that happens just makes us more irritable. I had to fight one of those days yesterday. Grass needed to be cut yesterday before the rain got here, so I went out to cut my grass. My lawnmower that I've had for 13 years, that has been a trusty lawnmower and literally has started the first time I pulled the cord. Every time that I pulled the cord, decided yesterday not to start. An hour and a half later, 4 pounds lighter and loss of fluid in my body, I finally got it started and cut the grass. I could have been irritated. I tried not to be. I got done with that. I cleaned up. I sat down to rest for a little bit before I spent the latter part of the afternoon working on some other things. And a phone call came in, and it was my son, and he said, "Have you had any trouble with the gear shift on the truck?" I said, "No, why?" He says, "Well, I'm sitting here, and it won't go into gear." I said, "Where are you?" He said, "I'm in the drive-through lane at La Hacienda." While we're on the phone, I hear a guy, I'm assuming it was an employee, at least I hope it was. I hope it wasn't an angry customer behind him, going, "Hey, can you move up here?" "No, I can't move anywhere right now. I'm working on it." I had to jump up and change clothes and grab some tools and try to figure out what might be wrong and bring what I needed to bring and go down there. And I got there and the heavens opened up and the rain poured down and I was soaked to the bone as I dismantled part of his dashboard to get to the shift linkage between the shift cable in the arm and hold it together as well as I could to at least let him limp until we could get the parts that we need to fix the problem. Couldn't have started raining at a worse time. It literally began to rain as I got out of my vehicle to go to work. Could have been irritated about that. I could have become irritable. I tried not to. I'll let my family answer after services as to whether or not I succeeded in that. What I tried to tell myself the whole time is, it could have been worse. At least the lawnmower started and I got the grass cut. And at least it wasn't a bigger problem like the transmission freezing up on the vehicle or something. It was just a small problem that a little bit of time and a little bit of sweat and a few parts are going to solve. It could have been worse, and so I try to keep a positive mindset about it. But it's easy to become irritable and resentful about things and then take that out on the people around you. But I don't do that if I love my neighbor as myself. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. That's what love looks like. It rejoices with truth. It bears all things. Love believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. Some translations put it in there, love thinks no evil. I love that expression. And what that means is that if I love my neighbor as myself, I do not look to label them as evil. I don't assume evil motives or evil actions on anyone's part. If I love them as I love myself, I assume the best and have to be proven that I'm wrong rather than the other way around. If I love my neighbor, the starting point is that they're good, that they're honorable, that what they've done is good and honorable. And I have to be shown and proven that that's not the case. Not the other way around. These attitudes are subjective. They reside within myself. I decide whether I'm going to be patient or whether I'm going to be kind. I decide whether I'm going to insist on my own way. I decide within myself whether I'm going to rejoice over wrongdoing or truth. I decide whether I'm going to bear all things. The fact of the matter is most of us will bear some things, but we don't bear all things. When I love my neighbor as myself, I bear all things. I believe all things. I hope all things. I endure all things. But I make those decisions within my own heart. Irrespective of who my neighbor is or what my neighbor is doing. I make those decisions. Galatians chapter 6, 1 and 2. Talking about spiritual aid. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. That's what I do if I love my neighbor as myself. I bring a spirit of gentleness to this process. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. That's what I do when I love my neighbor as myself. When I don't love my neighbor as myself, then I'm judgmental and I'm harsh and I go in there looking for blood. I go in there ready to take advantage of their misstep and capitalize on it to my benefit. But if I love my neighbor as myself, I don't do that. I'm gentle. I'm introspective about my own failings, and I bear up their burdens rather than capitalize on them. That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 11, encourage one another and build one another up just as you're doing. That's what I do when I love my neighbor as myself. I encourage and build them up. I try to make them better. 1 Peter 4:10, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whatever we want to define that as. I'm going to say it in general terms like this. Whatever skills, whatever knowledge, whatever abilities that I may have, whatever I have been graced with by God as a person, I've received that as a gift and I use it to the service of other people, not to the service of myself. because I love my neighbor as myself. That's what it means to love my neighbor as myself. Hebrews 10:25 says, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more. When I love my neighbor as myself, I don't make decisions based upon what is most convenient to me or I make decisions based upon what benefits them the most. And if I have an obligation to use my gifts to serve one another and to encourage and build one another up, then I have to present myself in places where I can do those things. Matthew 18:15 says, if your brother sins against you, this is what we're going to talk about, what it means to love your brother. This is what it means to love your brother. This is where the rubber meets the road right here. If your brother sins against you, you let him have it. And that's not what the Bible says. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. Be truthful with him. Between you and him alone. Protectful of him as well. Preserve his integrity. Preserve his reputation. Don't broadcast this to the world. You go to him as an individual, as a person, and you deal, you and him alone, with the situation where it can be solved and him made whole. If he listens to you, you've gained a brother. That's what I do when I love my neighbor as myself. I try to give them a way to retain their respect and their standing and their place before God and before men. This is what love of neighbor looks like in practice. And there are 1,000 other things that we could make part of this list. These things are not easy. They're not even always the natural response of humanity. Listen, the natural response of humanity very often is to lash out against people who hurt you and to take advantage of people that are weaker than you and to do. So the question becomes this, why should we behave this way? Why is it such a wonderful thing to love my neighbor as myself? Well, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19 says, we love because he first loved us. If we're going to be his children, if we're going to reflect him, if we're going to mimic the love that he has shown us, then we show that love to others. We love because he first loved us. Finally, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Be imitators of God as beloved children. We are God's beloved children, and as children who are loved by him, we should imitate him the same way that a child tries to imitate his father or his mother. Be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Why should I be this way? Because I've been the beneficiary of someone else's love. And I know the difference that it makes. And I know that apart from that love being shown to me, that I would be in a bad, bad place. And so because I understand the value of God having shown his love toward me, I understand the great value that there is in me showing love toward others. I understand that I can help them get out of a situation that they can't get themselves out of. They've done me wrong, maybe. They can't make it right. But I can find a way for it to be made right. They've failed to do something, and that not only affects their relationship with me, it affects their relationship with God. And until it's right with me, they have a problem with God. I can make a way. Not just for there to be reconciliation between me and them, I can make a way for there to be reconciliation between them and God as a result of that. By me showing love and compassion and concern by me speaking truth, by me reaching out, by me building the bridge, by me extending the forgiveness, they can be delivered. And that's what it's all about. It's all about men and women being reconciled to God. It's all about men and women's souls being delivered. And when I look at another human being, my neighbor, it's exactly how I ought to see them, as a soul created in the image of God. And I ought to treat them accordingly.